So 8 months ago, the United States told Canada to submit 5 demands: a sovereignty clause that would have given Washington veto power over Canadian trade policy, colonial-style mineral extraction, a currency ban that would have surrendered monetary independence, foreign policy alignment, intelligence conditions, comply or face economic consequences that would cripple your economy. That was the message. That was the threat. That was the expectation. Mark Carney looked at every demand, looked at the most powerful economy on earth standing behind them, and said, no, not let's negotiate, not let's find a middle ground, not let me consult with my advisors and get back to you. No. And then he didn't just resist, he built. What Carney built over the next 8 months has shocked Washington, stunned the global economic establishment, and fundamentally rewritten the rules of what a middle power can accomplish when it is led with discipline, patience, and precision. Canada's rise from trade war target to global economic force, from a nation expected to capitulate within weeks, to a nation now issuing ultimatums to the country that tried to bully it, is being called the most significant strategic transformation of a democratic nation in the 21st century. And Washington didn't see it coming. Not the speed, not the scale, not the depth, and not the permanence. Warren Buffett's assessment of what Carney has accomplished, and what he says about the difference between leaders who react and leaders who build, and which one Washington was facing all along without understanding it, is the analysis that explains why every major Canadian move in this trade war caught the White House completely off guard, because Buffett saw the pattern from the beginning, and the pattern is Carney. When you see the full arc of what Mark Carney has built, the alliances, the infrastructure, the leverage, the global position, and understand why each move was invisible to Washington until it was already complete, you'll understand why this story is being compared to the most remarkable strategic campaigns in modern economic history. Subscribe now, because this changes how you understand everything that has happened. To understand the rise, you first have to understand the man. Because Canada's transformation is not a story about a country that got lucky or a government that stumbled into the right decisions. It is a story about a specific human being whose background, temperament, and strategic methodology produced results that no one in Washington believed were possible. Mark Carney served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 global financial crisis, and Canada was the only G7 nation that did not require a single bank bailout. While the American financial system collapsed, while European banks teetered, while governments around the world poured trillions into emergency rescues, the Canadian banking system held. It held because Carney's regulatory framework was designed to survive exactly the kind of systemic stress that destroyed everyone else. He then became governor of the Bank of England, the only person in history to lead 2 G7 central banks, where he navigated the economic turbulence of Brexit with the same measured strategic discipline, a man who has spent his career not reacting to crises, but building the systems that prevent them or survive them when they arrive. Before central banking, he worked at Goldman Sachs, so he understands markets, capital flows, institutional behavior, and how money actually moves through the global system at a level that most political leaders never approach. When Washington looked at Carney at the start of this trade war, they saw a central banker, cautious by temperament, institutional by training, diplomatic by nature. They expected the behavior that central bankers exhibit: measured responses, careful statements, a preference for negotiation over confrontation. What they should have seen was a strategic mind trained in the most complex financial systems on earth, with a career built entirely on one principle: prepare for the worst before it arrives. Carney's fighting style is unlike anything Washington has encountered in an adversary, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything that has happened in this trade war. He doesn't telegraph his moves, he doesn't issue threats through press conferences or diplomatic leaks. He prepares quietly, positions methodically, and acts suddenly. And by the time the action is visible, the preparation behind it has been underway for months. He has never bluffed during this entire trade war. Not once, not in any dimension, not on any issue. Every statement he has made has been followed by exactly the action he described, delivered at the time and in the manner he specified. This consistency has created a credibility so absolute that when Carney says something will happen, markets move, allied governments plan, and Washington scrambles, because the track record permits no other response. He thinks in systems rather than events. Where Washington sees individual confrontations, a tariff here, a deal there, a threat on one issue, Carney sees interconnected systems where every move in one dimension affects every other dimension. The energy diversification supports the mineral strategy. The mineral contracts support the alliance network. The alliance network supports the financial independence. The financial independence supports the trade diversification. Every piece reinforces every other piece in an architecture that only becomes visible as a unified system after the individual components have been built and connected. He never retaliates emotionally. Not once in 8 months has Canada responded to an American escalation with an impulsive countermeasure. Every Canadian response has been calibrated to arrive at the moment of maximum strategic impact, targeting the specific vulnerability that creates the most pressure with the least cost to Canada. He treats the trade war not as a political drama to be won through rhetoric and posturing, but as an economic engineering problem to be solved through infrastructure, mathematics, and patient construction. Washington fights with announcements, threats, and press conferences. Carney fights with infrastructure, contracts, and mathematics. Washington fights in the news cycle, responding to the last headline, posturing for the next one. Carney fights in the timeline, building structures that will endure for decades, while the press conferences that oppose them are forgotten by morning, and the timeline always wins. Every time Washington expected emotion, Carney delivered calculation. Every time Washington expected capitulation, Carney delivered preparation. Every time Washington expected the response of a junior partner who understands his place in the hierarchy, Carney delivered the response of a strategic equal who was already 3 moves ahead and building the 4th. Washington never adjusted its model of who it was dealing with. They never updated the assessment. They never recalibrated the expectations. And that failure of imagination, that stubborn refusal to see what was actually in front of them, is why the White House has been stunned, repeatedly and predictably, by a leader they consistently underestimated from the very first day. The public dimension of Carney's defiance has been as remarkable as the strategic dimension. His domestic approval has held above 70% throughout the trade war, the highest sustained approval of any Canadian prime minister during a national crisis. Every party in Parliament backed the rejection of the 5 demands. Public support for resisting American pressure has consistently polled above 80%. Carney united a country across party lines, across regions, across the English-French linguistic divide that has defined Canadian politics for over a century, all behind the simple proposition that sovereignty is not negotiable. On the international stage, his standing has risen to a level that no Canadian leader has achieved in modern history. Invited to address the European Parliament, bilateral meetings with the leaders of Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, featured on the covers of international publications, treated by global media as the face of democratic resistance to economic coercion. 8 months ago, most people outside Canada couldn't name the Canadian Prime Minister. Today, Mark Carney is arguably the most respected Democratic leader in the world. That's the man. Now let me show you what he built. Because Canada's rise under Carney's leadership is not a story of luck or timing or fortunate circumstance. It is a story of strategy executed with a precision that has no modern parallel in democratic governance. The trade diversification alone represents a strategic accomplishment that most countries failed to achieve in a decade, let alone 8 months. The Germany-Canada corridor exceeding $180 billion in committed partnership across energy, minerals, industrial manufacturing, and defense cooperation was built from initial contact to operational framework in a time frame that stunned European officials accustomed to multi-year negotiations. The Commonwealth Trade Network, 56 nations with preferential trade pathways, was activated and expanded, giving Canadian exports access to markets spanning Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, was leveraged for the first time at full scale, opening Asia-Pacific markets to Canadian goods, energy, and resources. See it to deepen the European relationship. Japan and South Korea signed bilateral mineral and energy agreements at market rates. The United Kingdom became a strategic partner in a post-Brexit alignment that serves both nations. The share of Canadian exports flowing to the United States has fallen from approximately 75% toward 55 to 60% and continues to accelerate downward, a structural reorientation of trade flows that represents one of the most rapid diversification campaigns in the history of international commerce. And every partnership was built on the same methodology: market rate terms, sovereign equality, mutual benefit, the exact opposite of what Washington demanded. The resource dimension transformed Canada from a significant producer into a resource superpower. The 6.8 billion ton aluminum discovery, 97 years of global supply under Canadian sovereignty, added a category-defining geological asset to a portfolio that already included the world's 3rd largest oil reserves, massive natural gas deposits, the largest potash reserves on Earth, major uranium deposits, significant nickel and cobalt for battery manufacturing, and the world's largest supply of fresh water. Critical minerals locked into 25-year contracts with Germany, Japan, and Korea at market rates. Energy exports, 4 million barrels per day of crude plus hydroelectric power from one of the largest clean energy grids on the continent, weaponized into leverage that Washington cannot counter because physics doesn't respond to executive orders. Canada now controls virtually every critical resource that 21st century industrial economies require under stable democratic governance with the cheapest clean energy processing on the continent. The financial independence Carney built carries the signature of a man who literally ran central banks, Eurocad settlement systems reducing dependence on the US dollar for bilateral trade, institutional divestment capability over $180 billion in Canadian-held American assets that can be redirected under the financial decoupling mechanism, banking bypass systems built and tested. The Canadian dollar strengthening as global confidence in Canadian governance rises while confidence in American governance declines. Carney built financial independence with the precision of someone who understands exactly how currency systems, settlement mechanisms, and capital flows operate at the institutional level because he does. He governed two of the institutions that set those rules. Canada's global standing has reached historic levels. Credibility, the most underpriced asset in international trade, has become Canada's defining advantage. Canada is now the country that completes agreements, while America is the country that destroys them. NATO allies and Five Eyes partners are treating Canada as the preferred partner for defense procurement, resource supply, and strategic cooperation. Foreign direct investment is flowing into Canada at accelerating rates as companies reposition for a world where American trade relationships carry a risk premium. Skilled workers and entrepreneurs are choosing Canada over America. The brain drain has reversed direction. Washington spent its credibility. Carney banked it. And credibility once established compounds. And that's when Warren Buffett explained what he had been watching for 8 months. "I've watched leaders manage crises for 70 years, Buffett said. Political leaders, corporate leaders, institutional leaders. In that time, I've observed 3 categories. Most leaders react, they respond to events as they occur, with varying degrees of competence. A smaller number anticipate, they see threats before they arrive and position accordingly. Almost none build, they don't just respond to the crisis or prepare for it. They use it as construction material. They take the energy of the attack and convert it into infrastructure. Mark Carney is a builder, and I say that with 70 years of comparison. Every action he took during this trade war was not a reaction to what Washington did. It was a construction project. Washington imposed tariffs, and Carney didn't retaliate with tariffs. He built trade partnerships. Washington threatened energy revenue, and Carney didn't threaten back. He built pipelines, terminals, and energy compacts with European and Asian buyers. Washington demanded below-market mineral access, and Carney didn't negotiate. He signed 25-year contracts with other buyers at full market rates. In 70 years, I have seen exactly one leader turn every single attack into infrastructure, make every threat into motivation, convert every crisis into construction material. That's not defiance as an emotion. That's strategic engineering as a discipline. On the pattern that Buffett identified early, and that explains why Berkshire moved when it did. The pattern was there from the beginning, visible to anyone who was watching the actions instead of the press conferences. Step 1. Absorb the attack without reacting emotionally. Let the world see who attacked and who was attacked, and allow the moral clarity of that asymmetry to generate global sympathy. Step 2. Build quietly during the intervals between escalations. Use the time to construct alternatives. Partnerships, infrastructure, contracts, financial systems that reduce the dependency the other side is trying to exploit. Step 3. Reduce dependency systematically until the leverage becomes one-directional. Step 4. Act from strength. Only when the preparation is complete, only when the alternatives are operational, only when the dependency runs in one direction, then act. Suddenly, precisely, irreversibly. Carney executed this 4-step pattern across every dimension of the trade war: energy, minerals, finance, automotive manufacturing, international alliances, with identical discipline. Every single dimension. The same pattern, the same patience, the same precision. And Washington never recognized the pattern because they were too busy watching their own press conferences to study what their adversary was actually building. On the rise itself, Canada's rise is not an accident, and it is not luck. It is the product of strategic leadership applied with a consistency that I have rarely seen in any domain, let alone in public governance under the pressure of an active economic conflict. The numbers tell the story. Trade diversification accelerating, foreign investment surging, global standing rising, resource leverage expanding, financial independence deepening. Each number is a brick that Carney laid. And the corresponding story: America's loss of credibility, loss of allied trust, loss of trade leverage, loss of manufacturing integration, loss of the reserve currency's gravitational pull, is the mirror image. What Canada gained, America lost. And what America lost, it lost through choices. Choices that Carney anticipated, prepared for, and converted into Canadian advantage. The verdict. When history records this trade war, it will record the moment a middle power demonstrated that strategic intelligence can overcome raw economic size. That preparation defeats impulse. That discipline defeats ego. That a nation of 40 million people led with precision can outmaneuver a nation of 330 million people led with bluster. Mark Carney will be studied in business schools and diplomatic academies for the next 50 years. Not because he won a trade war, although he did win it. Because he demonstrated a model that has never been executed at this scale. How a smaller nation can transform an existential threat into a generational opportunity through strategic discipline applied consistently across every domain. Berkshire Hathaway's Canadian position is the largest we've built in any single country during my career. That's not sentiment, that's not politics, that's analysis. The analysis says Carney built something permanent, something that will generate returns for decades. And the analysis says Washington should have studied this man before they fought him. A central banker who survived the 2008 crisis without a single bank bailout, who managed Brexit's economic turbulence, who governed two G7 central banks, that man was never going to fold under trade pressure. The man who prevented systemic collapse was not going to be intimidated by tariffs. Now let me walk through the defining moments of defiance. The specific decisions that built the rise, because each one reveals something about who Carney is and how he thinks. The rejection of the 5 demands was the moment that defined everything that followed. Other leaders would have negotiated, would have accepted some demands and resisted others, would have tried to find a middle ground that preserved the relationship at the cost of partial sovereignty. Carney rejected all 5 demands completely, publicly, and permanently, with the backing of a unanimous parliament and a public that supported resistance at over 80%. He understood something that Washington's strategists didn't. Partial sovereignty is no sovereignty at all. Accepting even one demand, the currency band, the intelligence conditions, any of them, would have established the principle that American pressure could extract concessions from Canadian governance. Carney rejected the principle itself, and in doing so he established a different principle, one that has defined every subsequent interaction. Canada negotiates as an equal, or it doesn't negotiate at all. The walkout from the $730 billion deal was the moment that revealed Carney's strategic courage. When the White House inserted poison pills at the last minute, the sovereignty clause, the currency ban, the snapback tariff authority, Carney had a choice. He could have accepted a flawed deal worth $730 billion, absorbing provisions that undermined Canadian sovereignty in exchange for economic stability. Most leaders would have. The deal was enormous. The pressure was immense. The consequences of walking away were severe. Carney walked out in front of the entire world with $730 billion on the table. Trust is the currency of negotiation. You just counterfeited it. That requires a specific kind of courage, the willingness to sacrifice a good outcome today because you know the leverage for a better position is being built tomorrow. Carney knew. He had already started building. The Germany pivot was the moment that revealed Carney's strategic creativity. His ability to see opportunities where others see only constraints. Instead of returning to Washington to beg for a new deal, which is what Washington expected, what Washington's model predicted, what every historical precedent of a smaller country's behavior after a deal collapse suggested, Carney flew to Berlin. Within weeks, the $180 billion Germany-Canada corridor emerged, the most significant bilateral economic partnership between a North American nation and a European power in decades. Energy partnerships that gave Canadian resources direct access to European markets. Mineral processing investments that kept the value chain on Canadian soil. Industrial manufacturing cooperation that connected Canadian raw materials to German engineering. Defense procurement alignment that gave both nations supply chain security independent of American participation. Washington expected Carney to come back to their table hat in hand, ready to negotiate on whatever terms Washington offered. Carney went to a different table, in a different country, on a different continent, and the deal he built there was structured on the exact terms Washington had refused to offer. Market rates, sovereign equality, mutual respect, and no sovereignty clause. The Germany pivot didn't just diversify Canadian trade, it demonstrated to every government on earth that partnership with Canada was available, on fair terms, immediately, and that the line of potential partners stretched far beyond anything Washington had imagined. The electricity weaponization was the moment that revealed Carney's understanding of leverage at a depth that Washington's trade policymakers never approached, and perhaps never could. The trade policy adjustment surcharge on hydroelectric exports to the northeastern United States was a masterwork of calibrated economic pressure, a price increase large enough to land on every utility bill in New York and Boston, visible, personal, politically consequential, but controlled enough to avoid triggering the emergency blackout response that would have generated sympathy for American consumers rather than anger at American policymakers. The distinction between a cutoff and a price increase is the distinction between a weapon that creates victims and a weapon that creates voters, and Carney chose the weapon that creates voters because voters direct their anger at the people who cause their bills to increase. He weaponized physics itself. Water flows downhill, gravity generates electricity, and electricity in February in New York is worth more than any tariff Washington has ever imposed. Carney understood what Washington's trade policymakers still haven't grasped. The most powerful weapon in economic warfare isn't a tariff on goods that can be sourced elsewhere. It's a dependency on infrastructure that cannot be replaced in less than a decade, and the Northeastern Grid's dependency on Canadian hydropower was a weapon that cost Canada nothing to deploy and cost America hundreds of millions per month to absorb. The auto severance was the moment that revealed the full depth of Carney's preparation methodology. The termination of the bilateral automotive integration framework, $150 billion in annual trade. The lifeline of the North American auto industry stunned Washington because Washington assumed mutual dependency made it untouchable. What they missed was that Carney had spent months building the alternatives that made the dependency one-directional. The Volkswagen Gigafactory, the European automotive partnerships, the $25 billion transition fund, the workforce retraining programs. He built every component of the replacement before making the cut. By the time Washington realized what had happened, it was already done. The 48-hour ultimatum was the moment the power inversion became undeniable. Canada gave the United States 48 hours to suspend tariffs, publicly withdraw the 5 demands, and agree to unconditional negotiations or face $935 billion disassembled consequences. The country that was supposed to submit was the one setting the deadline. The country that was supposed to bow was the one holding the clock. The power inversion wasn't sudden. It was built brick by brick over 8 months, but the ultimatum was the moment it became impossible for anyone, in Washington, in global capitals, in the media, in the markets, to deny what had happened. What Washington is processing now is not a single event, but a totality. The cumulative weight of 8 months of strategic failure landing all at once. The shock isn't from one surprise, it's from the collective recognition across the entire American establishment, in the White House, in Congress, in the intelligence community, in the Pentagon, in the think tanks and media organizations and corporate boardrooms that shape Washington's understanding of the world, that Canada has undergone a strategic transformation so comprehensive that the United States failed to anticipate it, failed to prevent it, failed to understand it, even as it was happening in plain view, and is now unable to reverse it. The failure was not a failure of information. Washington had every piece of data. Every partnership Canada signed was publicly announced through normal diplomatic and commercial channels. Every infrastructure project was documented in publicly available filings. Every trade agreement was on the record and accessible to any analyst who cared to read it. The Volkswagen Gigafactory was covered in every major business publication. The Germany corridor was the subject of diplomatic cables. The Commonwealth activation was discussed at multilateral forums. Washington had the data. Every data point. What Washington lacked was imagination. Washington could not conceive of a Canada that would do what this Canada did, that would build what this Canada built, that would act with the decisiveness this Canada demonstrated, because Washington's model of the world does not include middle powers that outmaneuver superpowers. It never has. The model says smaller countries resist briefly and then accommodate. The model says economic pressure works because it always has. The model says junior partners don't issue ultimatums to senior partners. Canada broke the model, and the gap between the Canada Washington imagined, cooperative, dependent, ultimately compliant, and the Canada that actually exists, strategic, diversified, and led by a man who converts every attack into infrastructure, is the gap that explains every single moment of shock, every moment of being stunned, every moment of paralysis in this entire trade war. The strategic reassessment now underway across the American government is the most comprehensive in a generation. The Pentagon is recalculating North American defense assumptions that had treated Canadian cooperation as a given. The State Department is reprocessing allied relationships that have been damaged not just with Canada, but with every ally that watched America's treatment of its closest neighbor and drew conclusions about their own relationships. The U.S. TAR is evaluating a trade posture that has achieved none of its stated objectives, not one, while systematically strengthening the adversary it was designed to weaken. The trade war was supposed to last weeks. It has lasted months. Canada is stronger in every measurable dimension than it was before the first tariff was imposed. America's credibility with its allies has been catastrophically damaged. American trade leverage has diminished across energy, minerals, manufacturing, finance, and diplomatic influence. Washington is processing a reality it never planned for and never imagined. The trade war made Canada stronger and America weaker, not temporarily, not cyclically, structurally. The diversification Canada built is permanent because it's backed by signed contracts and physical infrastructure that will operate for decades. The alliances are institutional because they're embedded in multilateral frameworks with their own momentum. The resource leverage is geological because 6.8 billion tons of aluminum will be under Canadian soil for a century. And the credibility gap, the growing chasm between a country that honors its commitments and a country that destroys them, widens with every passing day that the trade war continues. The political reckoning is arriving in Washington with the force of structural failure. Bipartisan criticism of the trade war's results is intensifying as the costs mount and the achievements remain zero. The business community is demanding resolution as auto prices surge, supply chains fracture, and electricity bills climb. Swing state voters in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana are experiencing the trade war not as abstract policy but as higher car prices, job insecurity, and rising utility costs. The political class is doing what political classes always do when strategy fails, looking for someone to blame. But the failure is structural, not personal. It was built into the strategy from the beginning. You cannot bully a country into submission when that country has resources the world needs, a leader who thinks in decades, and trade agreements on 6 continents. Carney didn't create Washington's problems. He exploited them with the precision of a man who had spent his entire career studying exactly how systems fail. 8 months ago, Washington told Canada to submit. Carney said no. Instead of submitting, he built trade partnerships on 6 continents, energy infrastructure across 2 oceans, mineral contracts spanning 3 decades, financial bypass systems that reduce dollar dependency, allied coordination networks that include America's own closest partners, geological leverage that will outlast every political career currently active, and the strategic discipline to deploy each one at the moment of maximum impact while Washington was still processing the last move. Canada's rise was not luck. It was not circumstance. It was not an accident of resources or geography, although those helped. It was strategy, conceived by a man who understood that the greatest threat to his country could be transformed into the greatest opportunity of the century, and executed with a consistency that left the world's most powerful nations stunned, diminished, and scrambling to understand what happened. Canada's trajectory is now self-reinforcing, a flywheel of strategic advantage, where each gain creates the foundation for the next. The trade diversification accelerates as new partners generate new opportunities that attract new investment, that funds new infrastructure, that creates new partnerships. The resource leverage deepens as geological assets are developed with allied capital under long-term contracts that lock in access for decades. The financial independence matures as Eurocad settlement systems and institutional bypass mechanisms become standard operating procedure rather than emergency measures. The global standing compounds as every successful Canadian partnership, every completed agreement, every honored commitment adds to the credibility that Washington has been systematically spending down. Washington's window to reset the relationship narrows with each passing month as the structures Carney built become more embedded in institutional frameworks, more integrated into allied supply chains, and more permanent in every measurable dimension. The question is no longer whether Canada can sustain this trajectory. It can. The infrastructure is built. The partnerships are signed. The resources are geological, and the credibility is earned. The question is whether Washington can adapt fast enough to prevent the permanent restructuring of the global economy around the absence of American reliability. This is ultimately a story about leadership, about what happens when a nation faces an existential threat and is led by someone who thinks in decades rather than news cycles, who prepares for every contingency before it arrives, who never bluffs because bluffing is a tool of the weak and preparation is a tool of the strong, and who converts every attack into construction material because that is the strategy of someone who plans to be standing long after the attackers have exhausted themselves. 8 months ago, Washington expected submission. Today, Washington is stunned. The distance between those 2 moments, between expectation and reality, between what Washington assumed would happen and what actually happened, is the measure of what one leader built. Carney defied Trump. Canada rose. Washington is still processing what happened while Carney continues to build. And Buffett, who has watched leaders succeed and fail for 7 decades, called it the most impressive strategic performance he has seen in public leadership, not because Carney won the trade war, because he turned a trade war into a country's transformation, converting every attack into infrastructure, every threat into motivation, every crisis into construction material, and every American mistake into Canadian advantage. And that transformation built on sovereignty, discipline, and the simple, unwavering refusal to submit is just beginning.